Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Business in the Community's International Women's Day event, happening a few days before the big day on the 8th. The theme of our discussion today is one step forwards, two steps back. We're hoping to have a rich panel discussion, plenty of questions, lots of information and content for you to absorb, and an opportunity for you to contribute your thoughts on whether you think, when it comes to the gender equity at work agenda, when it comes to driving progress in the workplace, are we stuck on a bit of a loop around one step forwards, two steps back? What needs to change and how do we accelerate progress? Before I kick off today's session and introduce the panelists that we've got joining us, I wanted to take a moment to kind of ground this discussion and share some reflections about International Women's Day, the context that it's taking place in this year in 2024. First off, this is a time of real change and unpredictability, both in terms of the working world itself, but also the context that we're operating in. Some of the shifts that are taking place at the moment include working norms. We're all working, not all of us, but many of us, in different ways than we might have been a decade or so ago. Rising changes when it comes to technology, automation, artificial intelligence, a real shift in the way a lot of businesses are trying to do business. Ongoing changes to our demographics. When you look at the kind of profile of the UK's workforce today, it's very, very different than it might have been a few years ago. For example, 1 in 3 workers in the UK are now over 50. Alongside those shifts in demographics, we know also that we're experiencing quite a lot of attitudinal shifts in terms of what people are expecting from employers, what they're prepared to give employers, the role of employers and big business in people's lives. Alongside those big kind of almost mega trends, if you like, we know there are also quite a lot of legislative changes taking place. Certainly in the short term, this event, this year's International Women's Day, falls ahead of a few months where we're going to see a number of changes on the statute books around things like carers leave, the right to request flexible working, the way in which paternity leave and shared parental leave are administered, to name a few. In that context of time of kind of disruption and change and kind of big shifts that are taking place, what's happening when it comes to the gender agenda at work? My take is that we're in a place where there's very much mixed progress going on. There are a number of kind of positive indicators. Many of you will have seen the FTSE Women Leaders Review that came out last week, highlighting some really impressive progress that has happened in kind of senior business boardrooms around representation of women. Against that, there are perennial and ongoing issues that we really have yet to crack, whether we're talking about the persistent pay gap between different genders, whether we're talking about levels of harassment and exclusion that individual people are experiencing in the workplace. When we think about wider ideas about inclusion and people's ability to feel safe, secure, and like they belong in the workplace, it's very much a mixed picture. Some are warning that progress is beginning to falter. Others are saying there's a real danger that we'll slip back. So it's definitely a time of challenge when it comes to championing this agenda in the workplace. Against that bigger picture of what's going on around the backdrop, the demographics, the legislation, the attitudes, I wanted to offer a personal reflection also about International Women's Day this year. I've been running, hosting, speaking, participating in International Women's Day events for many, many years now in a number of different roles. And something different is happening this year, in my view. I feel like there's more frustration apparent. I think there are louder voices saying we need change urgently, we need to accelerate progress, we need to be leaping forward. It's not good enough, the direction of travel at the moment, the way in which it seems to be very slow and arguably stagnating. Many of you will have seen there's much more open criticism on platforms like LinkedIn about organizational efforts to champion gender equity, whether they're intersectional enough, whether they're genuine enough, whether they're really forward-thinking enough. So it feels like a very ripe time to be having this conversation, to be thinking about whether we're in a kind of one step forward, two steps back loop, and to be really challenging ourselves to think about what will the future hold when it comes to gender equity at work. What should employers be doing in the here and now to build that more sustainable, more equitable working world for all of us? To support this discussion and thinking about that context, today we've brought together quite a diverse panel of voices to share their reflections. We thought quite carefully about trying to showcase and hear from people with different vantage points on this agenda, people who are bringing different lived experience, different positions of influence and perspective, and different kind of context to this debate at this time of change. You can see in front of you, we've got a couple of details there. So in no particular order, we're joined by Ashley Ainsley, technologist by trade, co-founder of Colour in Tech, which is one of the organisations leading the charge around ensuring greater diversity in the tech workforce. He's a member of BITC's Youth Advisory Panel, and the list of accolades goes on, doesn't it, Ashley? So he's Forbes 30 under 30, Politico's one of the biggest, most influential voices in tech in the UK today. So really interested to hear his perspective. We've also got Mary Bright. She is Group Head of Social Impact and Sustainability at Phoenix Group. So Phoenix Group are one of the largest financial services and retirement businesses in the UK. You might not have heard of Phoenix, but you'll certainly have heard of a number of the different products that they offer. And they estimate that around about 1 in 4 UK households has some level of contact and engagement with their products and services. So we're really delighted to have Mary here because she's got kind of a very sort of broad perspective on this agenda. And as I said, she leads social sustainability and particularly the wing of Phoenix that is the kind of think tank aspect of their work. Alongside Ashley and Mary, I'm delighted to say we've also got Nitesh Prakash, who is a partner at Bain & Company, so one of the UK's biggest management consulting firms. He leads on energy and kind of infrastructure discussion. But he's here today particularly because of his interest outside of that. So he's a member of BITC's race leadership team, so the group of business leaders that inform our race and ethnicity campaigning. He's also proved a stalwart supporter of our gender campaign. So Nitesh and his team have worked on a number of different projects and campaigns with us, including BITC's recent Who Cares campaign around parental leave, and some current thinking that we're doing around flexible working. And I'm really delighted to say that he's going to be sharing some new insight that we've collaborated on around the business case for flexible working. If you're just thinking about kind of bottom lines, why does it make such good business sense? Alongside those three voices, we're also pleased to welcome Demi Walker. She is an actor and poet. We've just discovered that we live quite close to each other in London, and she is here on behalf of the Young Women's Trust. If you haven't heard of the Young Women's Trust, they're a fantastic charity who are championing the voices of young women at work today. My sense is that young women's voices sometimes get a little bit lost in the discussion around gender equity and inclusion at work, and so we're really, really delighted to have Demi here to talk about the Young Women's Trust perspective, and in particular the manifesto for change, their asks of employers around what they can be doing to support young women into work, able to flourish and feel safe, secure and kind of respected in the workplace. So a really interesting lineup of people. It should be a really rich discussion. We're going to kick off with hearing from each of these people individually, and then there's going to be plenty of time to ask questions, keep them coming in the chat, drop them through, and we should have a really rich discussion, and then we'll be aiming to close around about 11:15. Okay, so with that, we can take down that slide, and I'm just going to introduce Nitesh. So you can see in front of you, there's a slido.com. It's all about Slido. So Nitesh is going to be sharing first off. Sorry, I can see my whole face now, looking very big. Nitesh is going to be talking about flexible working. It's the topic of the hour. Rarely a day goes by that you don't see it on the front pages. Some businesses are loving it. Other businesses are saying no. I saw a household name bank's boss said yesterday that flexible working was an aberration that needed to be corrected. We know that flexible working can really drive inclusive workplaces. We know that for different demographics, particularly women, it can be a massive enabler of career success. So we're really concerned with making sure that you and your organisation stay the course and feel committed to flexible working. I'm going to hand over to Nitesh shortly, but before we do that, we wanted to poll you and ask you, what do you think is going on when it comes to flexible working in the UK labour market at the moment? Hopefully, what should be showing up for you now is the slido.com. Join with your smartphones, or you can join online and answer this question. Thinking about your own and other organisations, Do you think greater support for flexible working will continue? Really, really keen to hear your perspective. We've got, people on LinkedIn, we've got people on Zoom, drawn from a number of different organisations. What do you think is happening around this? So whilst we wait for that poll to come in, I'm just going to remind us all that when we talk about flexible working, we at BITC are really, really clear that this is more than remote working. It's more than hybrid. Yes, there's a big piece there about location, where you're working, but it's also about when you're working, your hours, the regularity around them. It's also about how work is being delivered, the level of autonomy and ownership that you have around the things on your to-do list. We're also very conscious that flexible working is something that we need to think about in different industries in different ways. It's not just about office workers having a few days from home. It's about thinking about the full scope of the UK labour market when it comes to flexible working. So we can see what's coming through there. It seems like the vast majority of you, 74, 75% of you, think that employer support for flexible working is here to stay. So that voice that said it was an aberration, hopefully he is wrong. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand over to Nitesh. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlotte. I was slightly worried in terms of what the data would show, but it's good to see that everyone's still rallying around flexible working. I think just before I get started, it's quite important to say that why are we talking about flexible working, or why are we even dwelling into this topic at all? And when Charlotte and I sort of originally had this question come up, I think we did have a debate around, there's a lot of noise around it. There is a lot of positives that are attached to it, and equally there are a lot of stigma that is attached to it, especially in the post-COVID world and in the world of people being called back to work, and there being a little bit of a debate around what is good and what is not good. And that's when we sort of decided we actually need to dwell into the data a little bit to understand what is it that the workforce truly wants and desires, and what is it that employers can cater to in a more sustainable and systematic manner. So I wanted to pick this up from sort of three different lenses. The first lens is very much applying the lens of the employee, i.e. the workforce. And interestingly, when you start looking at how high up does flexible working rank up in terms of the perks or the desired needs of the workforce, last year, flexible working was the #2 requirement, or the #2 most attractive benefit that employees wanted, and the #1 was job security. So if you put job security aside, it's very interesting to see that flexible working is ahead of competitive pay, of rewards, of career progression, of professional growth, you name it, and flexible working is #2. Also, what's interesting is back in 2020, and that was more sort of when we were in COVID. So, the workforce had experienced flexible, or a shape of flexible working by then. Flexible working was still number 17. So it's jumped up from number 17 to #2 in the past few years. And when we talk about flexible working, it's more encompassing. It's not just sort of working from home. It's how do you work? It's where do you work? And it's what's your contractual obligations, and so on and so forth. So there's a real desire from the workforce to explore flexible working and to have access to flexible working in some shape or form. The second lens that we wanted to apply was a bit of an outcome lens, i.e. what is the case for change and why should we do flexible working? It's great that the workforce and the employees want it, but as an employer, what is the benefit that I have when I think about offering flexible working? And we looked at the FTSE 100 companies and all of the companies that sort of sit, and we basically categorized them into two groups. We categorized them into a group of companies that provide or promote flexible working. So let's badge them as the high flex promoters. And we badged the second group as companies that were potentially still starting off on the journey, were either dabbling with it a little bit, or still unsure in terms of what should be the share of flexible working and what should be the interventions that they should provide. Having done that sort of segregation, What we then saw was that there was actually a direct correlation in the high promoters of flexible working and some of their outcomes in terms of inclusivity scores. So the high flexible promoters ranked the highest in terms of their executive gender diversity score. They ranked the highest in terms of their gender pay gap score. But it isn't flexible, and I want to sort of emphasize this very much. Flexible working isn't only about women; it's also about sort of other segments of the population, and we can dwell a little bit more into that in the Q&A. But coming back to the correlation, so the high flexible working promoters also ranked much higher on ethnic minorities on board, and they ranked much higher on the disabilities employment score. So as you can see, irrespective of the metric and from which segment of population you take it, there is a correlation between offering flex working for it to create a more inclusive and dynamic environment for employees across different segments. And the third lens that we wanted to apply was, this is great. We have a case for change. We know that the employers are starting to see benefits. The question then starts to arise around, okay, but how am I actually going to make this happen in my company? And there's obviously a cost associated with introducing flexible working or providing flexible working. However, where we landed was that the benefits from flexible working are likely to outweigh the investment, with potential for additional upside. So yes, there are about 5 to 6% of annual payroll cost, give or take, on what your starting point is and what's the size of your business, which is around sort of benefits, recruitment, the IT and security, and just the mere logistics of it. But equally, we think that there are some core benefits around how do you manage your real estate, how do you think about retention, how do you think about managing the absenteeism in your workforce, and then a few more which you can add on to that in terms of sort of productivity, salary sacrifice, and so on and so forth. On salary sacrifice, interestingly, what we did find was that individuals were willing to forego a part of their salary in order to have access to flexible working or be able to flexibly work based on the terms that were most beneficial to them and their setup. So hopefully a bit of a monologue, and we've got a supporting report that BITC is going to publish in the next few weeks, and you can sort of delve into the details and the data and the case for change then, but hopefully sets the tone and the case for change for flexible working a little bit.
Thank you so much, Nitesh, and thank you for summarising such a wealth of research that Bain and Co worked on. That was really, really helpful. So just to pull out that kind of really headline figures there. So flexible working has shot up the agenda in terms of what employees think is important when they're looking for prospective kind of new jobs or staying in their current job. Those organizations in the FTSE 100 who are showcasing a commitment to flex through adverts, through kind of talking about flexible working in the way that they recruit, appear to correlate with those FTSE 100 organizations that are also doing better on other inclusion metrics, including not just gender. And I think it's a really important point to land there, Nitesh. As you said, this isn't just about helping women. This is about being an inclusive employer for all different groups. And then finally, that piece about the cost benefits that actually embracing flexible working can really help when it comes to business bottom lines. Thank you so much, Nitesh. I know there's so much more we could talk about. So Nitesh is going to stick around, and I'm sure there'll be some questions coming through from the floor. We're going to segue now over to Ashley. So Ashley, you and I had a bit of a pre-call around what did we want to say, what were the things that were on your mind when it comes to kind of tech and inclusion, and we'd love to invite your reflections about what should organizations be thinking about, what might happen when it comes to kind of growing understanding and awareness around artificial intelligence and automation. But before we do that, we've got a poll. I've got a big note in my notebook saying do the poll before you go to Ashley. So can we bring it up on screen, please, Florence? So artificial intelligence, whether you call it just AI or you think about it as automation and AI, rare is the organization that isn't thinking about this, that isn't going to realize it has some sort of impact on their business, the way that they work. How about how many organizations are thinking about the way that it interacts with the ED&I agenda? So you might have a team in customer sales thinking about it. You might have a team in tech thinking about it. How many of you are making sure that your HR gang, that the people that are thinking about culture, the people that are responsible for really driving up your inclusion agenda, are they thinking about the impacts of AI? Should they be? Tell us what you think. Okay, so coming through there. So about half of the people on the call saying my organization hasn't really thought about the way that artificial intelligence intersects with the EDI agenda. And about 40% of you saying we're thinking about it. So with that in the bank, over to you, Ashley.
Hey. So thank you. I suppose it's probably the first thing that having the platform and being able to speak on this kind of topic. I think the first thing that I would reflect on is that is actually progress. I think if we were to go back even a couple of years ago, probably, just before the pandemic, and we were to ask people that sort of question, I think, people maybe say 1 in 10 organizations were actively thinking about it. So, that's a positive sign, and it shows actually a lot of the work that myself, so people on the call, and I suppose our wider ecosystem have been doing to kind of put this on the agenda has meant that in 3 or 4 out of 10 organizations it is on the agenda, and that's probably enough of a critical mass to encourage folks who aren't thinking about it to do so, because there'll be probably enough column inches and dialogue around it as they as they look at what their peers and competitors are doing on that as well. Now I think on the AI thing, there's probably 2 angles on it. So for context, I'm on an organization called Color in Tech. We kind of represent a community, I suppose, of around 35,000 people who identify as ethnic minorities in tech largely. And therefore that gives us a great insight into what people are thinking. We've been commissioned by the UK government to do some research, and we actually looked at specifically what does enable people from ethnic minority backgrounds in the technology sector, in the ecosystem, to progress in the workplace. And there are a few insights that kind of came from that research, which I'll weave into kind of my dialogue here. But I think going back to the very overarching point, there is a lot of evangelism over tech right now. There's a lot of evangelism over kind of AI, but there's also a lot of pessimism in that as well. And I think the answer kind of depends on how you want to look at things. Now, I suppose I have to be an eternal optimist, because the requirement, I suppose, to lead an organization means that you need to be. But I'm going to bring the tone down slightly, because I think if we are asking about what the impact is of AI on kind of gender equity, and again, not just for gender as well, obviously there's massive intersectionality in that. I am pretty pessimistic. And one of the reasons I am pessimistic is because of that 5 out of 10 piece that we still saw. Now, to kind of use a few examples, one of the conversations that we're having yesterday actually was on a press release that Klarna, the buy now pay later organization, put out, and I thought it was a really interesting one to share if you've not heard about it. So they came out with an announcement a few weeks ago or a few months ago, basically saying that business isn't going exactly in the way that they wanted, and as a result, they were doing a hiring freeze. But they wouldn't be backfilling any roles; they would just be using AI to replace the backfilling. So initially, in that first instance, you're thinking about, well, okay, so people leave the workplace for a variety of different types of reasons. What might those be? So it might be the requirement for flexible work, and maybe the organization wasn't offering that. It might be that you were actually potentially stepping out to have a career break, or to do something around parental leave, etc., etc. And obviously, if you decided to actually leave the organization rather than kind of go on mat leave or pat leave, etc., what does that mean in terms of the I suppose the equity in the organization, and in particular, one of the parts of the organization that came under focus was their customer service center. Now, again, traditionally, these are, I suppose, some of the more lower paying jobs in the sector, some of the ones that are, I suppose, more open to people who have requirements to work flexibly, because it's something that you can do quite easily remotely. It's something that, can work around lots of different types of hours, etc. And are roles typically disproportionately, uptaken by women in the workplace fundamentally. So we saw that kind of change, and one of the things that they announced after kind of about 6 months of doing that was actually that the AI chatbot that they had effectively launched into their contact centers was now doing the work of 700 FTEs. So not an insignificant amount of people. They estimated that had about a 40 million return to their bottom line in terms of profit. It reduced repeat queries and length of query time from about 11 minutes down to 2 or something like that. So people can, you can understand why, oh my gosh, it's AI thing. Where else can we put this in the organization? How else can we like drive further efficiency improvements? But what does that mean for some of the people who have been impacted? And I think there was a real question about to what extent are organizations thinking about this as a cost-cutting method compared to a productivity improvement tool, i.e., like when you have your labor, are you thinking about what you're doing with that labor to enhance growth and growth opportunities compared to are you just seeing AI as an opportunity to cut costs? Because again, when I think about kind of that cost-cutting angle to it, there will be that happens in the ecosystem, but it's kind of a lowest common denominator effect. Only one organization, I suppose, can be the most efficient. Only one can have the lowest operating cost. And just because you have the lowest operating cost, it doesn't necessarily mean you are going to have the most competitive product. And especially when it comes down to things like customer success, customer service, differentiated propositions, there are lots of things that we as people, like to think add value ultimately to to the companies that we work for and the value that we bring compared to just a commodity, just an apple on the shelf, just an orange at the market. And as a result of that, really, I'm thinking to what extent are employers and organizations thinking about how they're going to reskill, re-up and change that proportion of the workplace that is going to be displaced by some of these tools that will drive, cost efficiencies fundamentally. And it's great to see, as I said, progress that probably 3 or 4 out of 10 organizations are starting to look and think about that. How many are doing anything about it? It's probably another question. I imagine we'll see that pie slightly shrink somewhat. But actually, what does it mean for those 50-60% of organizations over there that weren't even considering that? Because I definitely know one thing that's on the CEO's agenda for sure, and it's how to use this AI to reduce some of the operating costs. So if we're not thinking about what that means for equity in the labor force, then what does it mean for folks who, as I said, disproportionately want more flexible workplaces? What does it mean for folks who are typically having to do roles which are more vulnerable, I suppose. We came up with a term, or I heard the term, shall we say, don't take credit for it, sunsetting roles. And what does that mean for positions which we know over time might actually decrease in their prominence? But are we doing anything to support the people who are in those roles? And I think that we're not seeing that same move to implementation as we are seeing the adoption to AI. So that's not to say people aren't considering these things or thinking about them. But on one hand, it's like, are we using the money and the cost savings that we have saved from this AI to invest in our workforce? Or are we just saying that's great for the share price, we'll reduce our operating costs, and that's a great quarter. And I don't think we're seeing that move to implementation in the same speed, which is one of the reasons I'm more pessimistic about it. Because lo and behold, we've seen the tech layoffs. About 300,000 plus people have been laid off already. Where are they going to go? What's going to happen? And disproportionately, a lot of the rumors and ruminations and some of the data starting to show that these are people who are ethnic minorities or are women, and actually a lot of the great efforts that people have put in to drive diversity over the last couple of years have been kind of rolled back through some of these layoffs. So those are some of the reasons I'm a bit pessimistic about it. I think, that's one. I mean, obviously AI has got the potential to do a lot of things, whether it's training and development. Interestingly, one of the things that came up in our biggest research pieces was actually harassment and discrimination in the workplace, and ethnic minorities in particular, feeling that that was a real barrier to their progression in an organization. The sense of harassment or feeling that they'd be discriminated against as they went through things. There is potential for AI to actually, be doing a lot more in this space, whether it's new tools for monitoring or reporting. There's a load of HR tech which will be coming that should be able to help some of these things. But we can't necessarily ignore who's building it and the role of the speed of what's happening in these organizations too. So I know I had 7 minutes. I'm going to pause it there because I've been watching the clock, and then I'll continue if there's any questions afterwards. Oh, you're on mute, Charlotte.
Maybe I'll be one of those people that gets sunsetted because of my tech proficiency of still needing to be told I'm on mute. Thank you so much, Ashley. That was a real rip-roar through some of the things that we talked about. So just to pull out, just in terms of kind of making that actionable, some of the things that we discussed yesterday. So I said to Ashley, tell me the score. Is it good or bad? Is AI going to help with equity, or is it going to bring us down? There's so many different voices. There's so much different analysis. One of the things that's really sort of ringing in my ears is there was an International Labour Organization report that estimated that twice as many jobs done by women or marginalized genders were at risk from the adoption of AI as men's, because of all the things that Ashley talked about there in terms of the preponderance of women in some of those lower paid, more automated roles that can be more easily replaced. So thank you so much for that. I was going to just pull out one particular thing that you mentioned there and that we talked about was, if your organization is beginning to think about AI and is perhaps somewhere on your journey around thinking about the equity and inclusion impacts of it, the kind of action points that we discussed was around scoping out which areas of your workforce might be impacted by that change, by that adoption, and getting ahead of the game in thinking about what you can do to support those individuals that are at risk of sunsetting, whether it's upskilling, retraining, redeploying, and really making sure that you do that before any rollout, and that you do so in a way that recognizes the kind of operating context of different groups have different access to training, different ability to kind of equip themselves and kind of navigate what's available in different workplaces. So really, Rich, we could talk about AI endlessly, but I think maybe we'll leave it there for now, Ashley. Thank you. Okay, so we've heard from Nitesh, particularly around flexible working. We've heard from Ashley, particularly around artificial intelligence and what might happen there. Now I've got lots of Teams messages popping up from people who are supporting us in the background here, but I'm going to be turning to Demi. And so Demi, let's just make sure I've got you on screen. So Demi is here from Young Women's Trust. And now I know, Demi, I think you were saying to colleagues, you were interested in understanding the gender profile of the people in the room. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so we were just having a bit of a background chat around whether or not we could craft a question. So I'm going to leave that with my colleagues. Craft a question that at some point will try and pop up during your section of this discussion to understand the profile of the people in the room. Going on my knowledge of the attendees, I think that what we often find, and maybe this won't be a surprise to you, is the vast majority of the people here will be people who identify as a woman, whether they're cis or trans. That typically tends to be the people that attend this event, not exclusively though. I might be making an assumption there. With that, I'm going to invite you to talk a bit about the excellent kind of thoughts and reflections that the Young Women's Trust want to bring to this discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I was just to give everyone that's watching a bit of context of that conversation that was going on in the background. I was just kind of flicking through the cameras and the names, and I just wanted to check that the demographic was versatile and inclusive, and all the kind of things that we're talking about in this discussion. I wanted to kind of see if that was reflected in the people that were listening to this conversation and a part of this conversation, because I think it's really important as a charity, but as a young woman, that we start humanizing this process, which is one of the real aims that we have at Young Women's Trust, with collaborating with young women and really giving them and people like myself the voice to speak on our behalf. I'm a young Black woman who has kind of been impacted by the chain of inequality through race, discrimination, the pay gap, inequality, the whole chain of inequality since I was 14 years old. And as I've gotten older, my voice has become more articulate, more loud, more assertive, as my morale and my values have grown from injustice. And from that, from finding my voice, I've been afforded the opportunity to work with companies like Young Women's Trust, as well as a few other charities as well, who champion giving voices to the people whose problem it is, who's most impacted by the problems. So I just wanted to really kind of hammer in today that yes, there's statistics, yes, there's AI, yes, there's all these things, but at the core of the problem is the people that are being impacted day to day by these problems. I just wanted to kind of bring it back to International Women's Day before I kind of go on to our manifesto. Yes, it's a celebration of women and also a reminder of the struggle for gender inequality, but it's also a chance for us to reaffirm and recommit as individuals our specific tasks that we need to do within our organizations, or even the bigger ecosystem of women in inequality. What is our roles in our day-to-day life aside from just our job title? How can we be active in equality for women in our day-to-day. But I just wanted to kind of leave that comment there, because sometimes I feel like the process when we're talking about this can be just so statistic, this, that, and actually the core problem is people like me that are impacted day to day. Not just me, but all women, or women, people that regard themselves as women. Now, we know at Young Women's Trust that women aren't getting a fair deal in the workplace. And we've created a manifesto that shows what needs to happen to create workplaces where women have equal chances and can fulfill their potential to thrive. And through vigorous research and reporting, we have kind of narrowed this very big issue into 5 core big asks, and we're asking employers, line managers, policy changes, HI, EDI, we're asking everyone to be involved in these big asks collaboratively with Young Women Trust, but also individually within your own units. So our 5 asks are fair and equal pay, no unfair barriers to work, support to progress, job security, and no discrimination. And on face value, they seem like really simplistic things that should already be in place and should be employers' priorities. However, through the vigorous data that we've been collecting over the last 5 years, this is just not the case. So today I'm going to be focusing on fair and equal pay and no discrimination, as we've only got a couple of minutes to kind of narrow down and hammer in these really core issues. So if I speak a little bit fast, that's why, but please just ask me questions if I'm not clear. So what we know at Young Women's Trust is that women are being paid 1/5 less than men from the very beginning of their career. And this kind of averages out to about a £4,000 a year difference. According to Young Women, 23% of young women have been paid less than men for the same work. And we know that 13% of HR decision makers are aware of the problem, and they're aware that women are being paid less. The fact that women know they're being treated with their pay gap, and we know that HR makers are aware of the problem, and yet it's still not being addressed, and the numbers are still reflecting the inequality. Specific areas that Young Women's Trust have really seen that really leave this scope for inequality within companies is leaving salaries open for negotiation, basing pay on candidates' previous salary, and secrecy about pay. And all these problems kind of leave this grey area, and this area where it leaves open scope for inequality across the board. Young Women's Trust, after vigorous research and discussions, have kind of come to one solution for this. And that is salary transparency. If companies are transparent about their wages, then it really closes that gap. So, for example, showing salaries clearly on job adverts, not asking women for their previous pay and their previous salary history, and most importantly, providing clear bands and showing the skills and knowledge that employees need to gain to move up. So promotions are fair and transparent. And they're just some of the ways that we can immediately work out how we can really fix this pay gap. Another one is discrimination. Now, discrimination is a really big, complex can of beans, as are all of these issues. But what we have found is around half of women are experiencing discrimination at work. And discrimination can take many forms that not necessarily we're including in the bracket of discrimination. That means not being given the same opportunities to progress, pay inequality, inappropriate comments, being excluded, and sexual harassment. Now, according to Young Women's Trust's annual survey in 2003, discrimination is on the rise. 50% of young women who have reported experienced this, in comparison to 42% of women the year before. So we know that there's a really big growth and a gradual growth in discrimination. We're also aware that 34% of HR decision makers are aware of instances of discrimination within their organizations. So again, with the fair and equal pay, we know the problem, the women know the problem, and HR decision makers know the problem, but they're just not being tackled at the rate that we need. Now with discrimination, as I said, it's complex, but we've kind of simplified the solution as much as we can into some clear action points. So the first one is listen, consult, support, and check in with young women. How often are leaders or spearheads of the company checking in with women's voices from the beginning to the end of reporting discrimination? Have you got clear steps for reporting and the outcomes of discrimination? A lot of the research we saw showed that there might be clear steps of reporting, but maybe people aren't aware of it, or they report it, but they're not clear on what the outcomes may be. So something that companies can really do is make that process very clear and outlined. A second thing is zero tolerance culture. Leadership from the top all the way down to colleagues, encouraged and supported to call out racism, discrimination, harassment. A lot of the time there's a lot of shame centered around reporting, but actually if we can change that culture, then it will encourage people, especially young women, to use their voices. The third one is collaborate with young women when developing policies and on discrimination. How many times are young women included in the conversation about rights that are about their own well-being? Really important. And the last one, which I really want to hone in, I started with this because I just had to get it out, but I want to kind of leave again on this note: humanizing people's experiences beyond data and experience. We can talk a lot about, technology and data and all these things, but at the core of all of this problem is a young woman's experience and feelings. And that should always be the priority for all companies when we are dealing with any inequality. Who are the people that are most impacted, and how do we focus on their well-being and support immediately? And then all the other things of how we can support come in, but we need that support for young women now, because there's while we're changing things in different policy, young women across the board are still being impacted negatively. So how do we start to really solve that issue and support young women who've gone through all of these equalities for 20, 30, 40 years, women that are in their later years of life? They need support now, not in 5 years' time when the policy's changed. So that's a really important thing that I really want to just leave you all with. And the last thing I want to leave you all with is, what is a safe space to you, to your organization, and to a woman or a woman with accessible needs? And are you creating truly safe spaces? And what does that mean? Some things that I'd really love for you to think about is the sensory system when people walk into a space, the tone, the color, what's on the walls, what are you showing, how are organizations representing themselves when they say these are safe, inclusive spaces, and how do they feel that to the person that you're bringing into the room? I'm done. I know I've said a lot really quickly, but yeah,
that was wonderful. What a call to arms, and how lovely to have your passion and your demands represented so well. We really appreciate you taking us through that. Thank you so much. So much that we could pick up on there, but I was going to allow myself to just pick up on 3 particular key sort of moments there, if I may. So one, lovely to have somebody say so explicitly and so clearly, remember the people, let's bring the humanity into this conversation. Certainly I know that I can get a bit focused on the dots and the specifics and the kind of the data, and you need that, but you mustn't lose sight of the individuals that are affected. Two, in terms of some of the actions that you really highlighted for us there, salary transparency. It's coming. There's legislation happening in Europe. There's legislation happening in the States. It's going to become a bigger and bigger issue here in the UK. And BITC absolutely supports the calls to end salary history. So stop asking people about what their current or previous salaries were, and to embrace salary transparency. So being much more open about what the boundaries of a kind of role salary are, rather than expecting people to kind of negotiate. And then finally, I think a big point that you were making there was about listening, about making sure that when you're developing policies, when you're thinking about what you're doing going forward, the people who are most affected by those changes that you're most seeking to support or empower are actually part of that discussion, and they need to be included. And certainly on sexual harassment and discrimination, that's one of the things that we see a lot of organisations beginning to think about more clearly now. And then just a final point, just because you talked about kind of sensory experiences, I think there's bits of data that kind of come across my desk that aren't always highlighted and shown. But one of the things that our everyday inclusion campaign that we have as an ongoing area of focus for BITC found was the power of whether or not people see themselves represented in corporate imagery around kind of corporate PR glossies in adverts, in job adverts, on holding slides, on kind of recruitment packs. And actually people really do take quite a lot of a read about whether an organisation is inclusive, whether it's for somebody that looks like me, according to the kind of imagery and style that's used in those places. There is very clear data backing that up. So lovely to have that highlighted as well, Demi. So thank you so much. I know you're going to stay for questions, but we've heard there, I'm going to turn to Mary in a second. So we've heard there, just to kind of recap, we've heard from three quite different voices focusing in on some different issues that I asked them to talk through. So Nitesh showcased very clearly for us about why flexible working needs to stay, should stay, and the business case for really investing in it, and the way that it can be a real gateway to inclusion. Ashley talked there about the potential impacts of artificial intelligence, how that might intersect with equity and inclusion in the workplace, and a particular call to think in advance around how an organisation's shift in kind of technological senses might impact on different people, sunset different roles, and to really start doing some innovative thinking about training, upskilling people that are most impacted. And then finally, we heard from Demi, who covered a range of different areas of perspective from a young woman's perspective around this agenda, and a few kind of key actions there around salary transparency, bringing people into the discussion, don't forget the individuals, listening, and really paying attention to kind of what safe spaces in your working environment look like, whether they're actually genuinely safe for everybody that works for your organisation. So a real kind of raft of mixed issues there. So we're going to pivot now, and I'm going to invite Mary, who, as I mentioned at the beginning, is is Phoenix's Group Head of Social Impact and Sustainability, and invite your reflections, Mary, around it's International Women's Day 2024. What should employers be thinking about? What should they be doing? What's the change that we need to see? And of course, welcome to reflect on what some of the other speakers have shared so far as well. Over to you.
Thank you. Do you know, when I've listened to everybody, I've thought, well, why is it so bloody hard? Honestly, there is so much information there, and it's, you know, Demi, I loved what you're saying. You know, it shouldn't be that hard to say this is what the salary is for a job, should it? It shouldn't be that hard when people want it and businesses benefit from it to advertise flexible work. None of this should be hard, but it is. And so I've just been reflecting a bit about that. And I don't know if anybody saw the Daily Mail this morning. It highlighted how Jeremy Hunt is likely to crack down on woke councils who promote equity. But good news, Ashley, it's going to double the amount of spending on AI and give an extra 100 million into the Turing Institute, supposedly. The banking boss that you mentioned, Charlotte, I was also, in advance of this, reading some research that was done about attitudes to equity. And 1 in 4 men in the UK of working age think that it's all gone a bit far and it's harder to be a man than to be a woman. Can I just say it's not a competition? It's we all win when anybody wins. But I think it's really sad that that is a statistic that's growing in our society, and it's the same actually globally, that sort of trend. And it makes me particularly sad when I hear women And there are various female bosses, including another banking boss, an insurance boss, who have said that women are going to suffer if we work flexibly. Women won't suffer if we work flexibly if managers are good. And this comes back to the don't try and fix the women. Let's think about the change that is in all of us, and think about what it is that we can do. And then I thought, well, who are those people who have done really great things? And Henry Ford, famous for loving a black car, was also a pioneer just over 100 years ago, because he introduced the first 5-day week and revolutionized the way of working in factories. Workers in America then stopped having to work 6.5 days. And the 5-day week came into manufacturing. It took George Boot, wasn't it? I think it was in the early 1930s that Boots became the first UK company to introduce it. So in 100 years, we've still got bosses saying something that was introduced 100 years ago is the way it should be. When we've got Ashley talking so eloquently about the changes that AI are bringing, and yet we've got some people thinking that we should go back to 100 years ago, I just think that the answer for us to take away today is change, because change is in all of us. And everybody has spoken eloquently, and I could speak an awful lot more, but I'll stop now, Charlotte, because I know we're all really keen to hear questions.
Thank you so much, Mary. And I know that we could talk about so many different angles around all of this, but that was a lovely summary of some of your reflections. And I think one of the things that your comments there made me think about is, there's that old kind of quote about it's all just a bit of history repeating itself. Some of the challenges and the difficulties that we're looking at now, and some of the kind of ways that we're thinking, how do we overcome these? We don't need to look that far back to see occasions and moments when the working world, when the extent to which the working world is inclusive and supportive was very, very different, and changes happened and took place. And so I feel it's really nice to kind of, this isn't the first time we've had to cross some of these challenges. We've overcome other challenges in the past, and there's a lot to be learnt that we can take forward. So thank you so much, Mary, for that. Okay, so we're going to be turning to questions now. So over to you. We've got about 10 minutes. You've heard from our different speakers there around different kind of topics and issues. They've all got a wealth of kind of knowledge and issues. So I'm going to ask for questions before we do that poll, Florence, if that's okay. What are your thoughts? What are the things you'd like to know more about? So pop them into the chat. And I know there's a few coming through now that I can see, and some that are coming through on LinkedIn. So the first one we've had come through, Ashley, when we talked about AI, we talked very much about the role of AI and potentially replacing or kind of usurping some of the people that are in work at the moment. But somebody's asked about it from the other angle of, what are your thoughts on bias in the tech that's available in and of itself? So numerous studies have shown race bias in tech and AI, for example. Really welcome any reflections from you on that.
Yeah, it is. I think we can see kind of Google's Gemini, I think, the other day. I mean, if anyone's not seen that, it was coming out with some let's say questionable images, and in a way that's probably a reflection of trying to overcorrect in some instances, probably for biases that they suspect exist within the outputs. I mean, it's bias in, bias out. Do you get what I mean? Like, if you're having data which is collected in a way which is inherently biased, if you take people's photos, who are the people who've had historically lots of photos taken, or what context are those photos taken in and shared? If you've got data that you've always been collecting around men, for example, but not women's role in the workplace, or how they feel about certain things, or all of that, then it's no surprise that when something's learning, much like a child, they'll learn some of the behaviors that we have as adults, and the AI wouldn't really be any different, to be honest. So yes, I think that, and I think we have to be wary of that. I think a lot of the big tech companies are a bit more conscious on that, and I think some of it will still be trial by error. I think the question that we have to ask as a society more so is, so you know, with what consequences are those errors? And, you know, going back to what does that mean for organizations, I think it's really important, going back to that poll that we had at the initial, that organizations are thinking about, well, what are some of the unintended consequences if we get this wrong? How do we manage those? What is our position on that? And actually, in some instances, you know, is the damage more damaging than actually if we didn't? Because, you know, I always say that the cost of DEI in, you know, not doing it well, for example, is, you know, you just feel it in bad PR, frankly. You know, you put out this stuff, people notice it, people think your products are bad, and, you know, you feel it in terms of your customer conversations and the column inches that you have negatively against what you do. So, you know, I think people need to really be conscious about thinking about that, and probably really having a renewed focus within their teams to think about that, you know, those unintended consequences, but not just internally. Talk to external organizations about that as well, because they will have a purview and talk to people within society that you within a business won't do. You will not have the whole comprehension about all the different types of users of your products or how people might perceive them, even if they don't use your products, because then they're potential customers. And yeah, I think organizations really do need to think about not just internal testing, but actually how can they talk with you know, trusted groups outside of their company walls on some of these issues as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think this is a really emerging issue, going back to the top of that, in terms of the bias in tech. It's there, it's happening, and organizations need to be really, really vigilant around it. Okay, pivoting to another question we've had. So I'm going to come to Nitesh on this. So somebody said, what do panelists see as key reasons for ongoing and even arguably increasing discrimination against women in the workplace? And Nitesh, I was particularly keen to hear your perspective on this, because the work we've done together around addressing the motherhood penalty or the caring penalty, so the tendency for people who have caring responsibilities that are disproportionately fall on women, to find it harder to kind of access and progress in the workplace. What do you think are some of the key reasons that people experience discrimination?
Thank you, Charlotte. I did see that question, and the thought that occurred to me was that I probably got a bias over here, and I'm sure the other panelists will have a much more balanced view on what it is. And let me talk to you about my bias, because while it may not be the only reason, it is one of the reasons, right? And as you said, we've sort of looked at the data, and we've looked at you know, individual case studies of employees as well as sort of collective employees in a workforce. And essentially, there is a thing called the motherhood penalty. I think the data sort of says that anyone who takes time out to have a child is disproportionately disadvantaged, and it can take up to 10 years for them to make up or be at par with their sort of counterparts or their non-parent colleagues. And I think equal parental leave, equal and enhanced parental leave, not shared parental leave, is one of the big sort of factors and equalizing notions over there. I think the more we can talk about parents as parents and not parents being only mothers, I think does help take that a long way. But that is one of the many factors. Like I said, I'm sure the other panelists are much more well versed on the other topics.
Thank you, Nitesh. And lovely of you to kind of couch it in that context. Everybody brings their own kind of perspectives and kind of context to these discussions, don't they? So Demi, why don't I turn to you then? So just to kind of reiterate that question, just bringing it up there. What do you think are some of the key reasons for ongoing discrimination in the workplace? And perhaps you could share a perspective around kind of the young woman's perspective. Like, why do young women experience so much discrimination at work?
Yeah, I think thank you, Vikesh. It's it's very complex, but I do agree with Vikesh. Like time out for raising a child is something that has been continuously looked down upon when women are trying to re-enter work. As Vikesh lovely said very eloquently, it takes up to 10 years for women to recover after having a child. And if we can, again, humanize that process into men and women, it kind of takes it off the pressure, I suppose, off of women, actually all parents support. So that's one of the factors. Another factor we found was age discrimination. Young people coming into the workplace and getting lower pay because they're younger. a lot of young females that are coming into the workplace kind of on entry-level jobs, maybe starting at a lower entry level to men that are maybe straight out of college or straight out of school are getting apprenticeships and things like that, whereas women aren't really getting those opportunities on construction sites as much. So again, that's another one. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much, Demi. Well, I was just gonna come in there because I think one of the things we haven't totally drawn out in the panel yet, but I'm going to come to Mary to kind of add into here is the kind of age angle on this discussion around International Women's Day. So there's a couple of things I wanted to kind of share for this space. So one, Demi, as you were saying around the gender pay gap, we know that at 16, 17, when people are school leavers and they're accessing apprenticeships, there's already an apprenticeship pay gap at 16, 17. So despite the knowledge, as Natesh was referencing, that the caring penalty is a massive driver of inequity in the workplace, actually just outright discrimination because of gender happens very, very early on, and that mechanic apprenticeships are earning more than hairdressing apprenticeships, and that actually, and the tendency for different genders to kind of locate themselves in different places plays out there. But Mary, looking at it from the other angle, okay, so we started today talking about how 1 in 3 workers in the UK is over 50 now. We know that many of the people on the call will be managing multi-generational teams, maybe 6, even 7 generations of people in the workplace. We've had a question come through here. Let me just make sure I do it justice. What are your thoughts about how to ensure multi-generational workplaces flourish? And particularly, I guess, the angle there in my mind is the way that kind of ageism and sexism can kind of intersect and form a bit of a double whammy. Love to hear your reflections.
Yeah, so age really is the factor that will exacerbate any other protected characteristics. So as a woman, maybe, Demi, we're never the right age, and that's something I quite often say, because you're too young, you're too late to have a baby, you like to be menopausal or whatever. But as we get older, whatever those characteristics, it gets harder. And ageism is one of the protected characteristics that employers will quite happily say they discriminate on, and that affects both older and younger. What do you do, Charlotte, about that? Excellent question. The first thing I say, that there is more in common than divides us. So Natesh referenced the research around flexible work jumping to number 2 in people's desires. That's the same across every age group. What makes good work is largely what motivates people, having a sense of purpose, having a work that will fit their work-life balance. One of your manifesto asks about job security, which came up top in Bain's research. So these things that we all want unite us, but this same, what puts us the 2 steps back, the things in society that try and divide differences between us, is what we need to overcome. So in Phoenix Group, we've got a multi-age network where we meet based on our interests, and we talk about what we want from work, what we want our policies to be, and what experiences we've had. So if you're a gay man in the workplace and you're in your 60s, your working life as a gay person has been entirely different to somebody entering the workplace now. And that's just brought out such a depth of conversation and of understanding of different generations' experiences. So it goes back to the changes in all of us. So tips for managing a multi-generational workforce, tips for promoting gender equality, tips for enabling successful flexible working. It's in all of us to bring our values and to bring our self and our values to the workplace.
Thank you so much, Mary. Really thoughtful reflections, and I've definitely felt, listening to you all, inspired to kind of do more. We've got a few more questions coming through, but I'm actually going to press pause on the questions for the panel for a second and instead turn the tables on the audience here today. So you've heard us talk about the different topics and areas of challenge and opportunity that we think are coming down the line. What we're interested to hear from you about is what you think the different kind of things that are emerging in the workplace at the moment will be and will demand attention around. So Florence, if we can pop up on the slide there. So when you think about kind of issues that are part of the gender at work debate, so we've talked about flexible working, pay transparency, inclusion, shifting technology, parental leave, what are the newer or emerging topics that you think are beginning to or will demand attention in the future? So this should be a word cloud, so just pop anything in, it's anonymous, we're just interested to know. And when we say newer or emerging topics, I'm going to offer one myself. I've been campaigning around gender issues in one shape or form for a very long time now. I don't think I could fall into the young woman bucket anymore, Demi, I'm afraid. I think I'm one of the later life people that you were referencing at the beginning there. And I'm a bit embarrassed to say that the concept of kind of menopause in the workplace is something that I've only come to quite recently. So yesterday I had the privilege of attending a roundtable in Downing Street talking about menopause. And I have to be honest, I think 5 years ago, I'm not sure that I personally would have really been thinking about that issue. It's something that affects 51% of the workforce. Now, I was really pleased to see at this event how many different organisations, different employers are really, really thinking about the proportion of their workforce that might be experiencing the menopause and what that means in terms of an inclusive working practice and culture. So what do you think are some of the issues that are emerging? They might be new, or they might be issues that are only just getting the attention that perhaps they should have had before. We're really, really interested to see what's coming through there. Okay, and the clever tech, I don't know, Ashley, whether I should say this is AI or just automation, is making big things bigger and things that only a few people are saying smaller. Gender pensions gap, one of the things that Mary and I had talked about, that, you know, the pay gap in the here and now translates into a significant pensions gap in later life. Manager skills, gender fluidity, lots of different things being discussed there. One of the things that we talk about at BITC, kind of trans inclusion in the modern workplace. We've got a product that can support your organisation around that. Coaching, cost living, lots of different things coming through. Okay, so we're going to leave that up for a second. So turning to the panel, what's going to happen now is I'm going to do just a few minutes on BITC's plans going forward around our campaigning this year. And then provided we have enough time, and I'm in charge of it, so we should do, I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask you each for one reflection on International Women's Day 2024. And I'd ask you to have that reflection be something that you're feeling positive or hopeful about. So I'm going to give you each a kind of snapshot, something you're feeling positive or hopeful about this International Women's Day 2024. So with that, I'm going to turn to sharing BITC's campaigning plans for the year ahead. So panel, be ready for me to come back to you. Thank you, everybody, for sharing those things there. I think I'm going to reference a few of them in a second. So if we take that down now, Florence. So you can see from today that we've covered a lot of different issues. There's a lot of different opportunity. There's a lot of different challenge. There's lots of different agendas at the moment when it comes to driving progress around gender equity in the workplace. Here at BITC, we've been thinking about this for a very long time, and I'm going to share with you now a kind of preview of a new campaign that we're going to be running. So if we can bring up my slides, please, Florence. This is something we've been working in collaboration with our gender equality leadership team. So the C-suite senior business leaders that work with us around driving our campaigning work here at BITC. Equal Futures is a new campaign that we've designed at BITC. It takes an absolutely fundamentally intersectional approach, and it's got two very clear goals. One, we want to drive up appetite for action on gender equality at work. We're a bit concerned that there's a degree of gender fatigue, there's a degree of kind of resting on our laurels, there's a sense that perhaps organisations are a bit confused about where they should be putting their efforts, and we want to remind them of the importance, the absolute fundamental necessity of taking action on gender equity at work. The second thing we want to do is, having built up that appetite, continue to grow that demand, is we want to ensure it translates into real action, that some of the specific recommendations that we and others already know about and that are emerging as the world continues to change are actually leading to real change, that people aren't just kind of committed and aspirational, but that we're seeing a very clear, hard translation into real impact. So with those twin goals of kind of accelerating the appetite for and the action on gender equity at work, I'm just going to talk in a bit more detail about how we're going to achieve those aims. We're going to do a really intense piece of work looking at the why. We think there needs to be a restating of the need for action on gender equity. And we're particularly keen to highlight within that the business case. I think anybody that's come to this event today has probably signed up hook, line and sinker to doing more around this, but you probably come across people in your organisations and your wider lives who still question whether this is necessary. We heard from one of the speakers today about the stat saying that 1 in 4 young men think that the action around gender equity has gone far enough. There's new data coming out tomorrow from the Global Institute of Women's Leadership that sort of highlights that disjoin and the extent to which a number of people feel that we've done enough. So we're really going to be highlighting why. And then we're going to have a very, very clear focus on the how. We and others could write the book, indeed some of us have, around what should be happening when it comes to gender equity at work. But as we've sort of uncovered today, it's a really moving space, it's a really dynamic space, and there are newer and emerging challenges that we don't necessarily know all the answers to just yet. So that's one of the things that this campaign is going to be looking to do, is to really provide a clear kind of route map through some of those more progressive, more modern, more kind of contemporary challenges that are coming through, how organisations can navigate them with gender and inclusion at your heart. So that's the vision, driving up appetite for and action on this agenda, making sure we've got a really clear answer to why, and really explaining clearly what the how consists of, both historical knowledge, but also in those contemporary issues. Now, to support this, we've been doing quite a lot of work with stakeholders, with other colleagues, thinking about what are those newer and emerging issues that we think businesses and employers need greater guidance around right now. So if we just flip to the second slide. Now, I was pleased to see a number of these come up in your judgment around what some of those newer and emerging issues were. So I'm just going to kind of run through these very, very quickly, not in any detail. Clearly, AI, automation, organisations need to be supported, and we're determined to do that, to take a really inclusive approach. Growing interest and awareness around women's health, thinking about it through the sort of duration of the life cycle. Ongoing challenges around combining caring and earning, and that really seems to be something that's rising up the agenda in terms of supporting working carers with all different kinds of responsibilities to flourish at work. Financial well-being, and I've put well-being in quotes there because I'm not sure that's exactly the right phrase, but in the context of a cost of living crisis, in the context of a widening gap in living standards, and in knowledge that, for example, when you look at kind of older workers or people that have recently retired, there's still a really big perennial issue around pensions gaps. We want to think very carefully about what we should be supporting our organisations to do around championing financial well-being. Hybrid working, we've talked about some of the pros and cons there. One of the things that I'm quite mindful of is there's quite mixed data coming through about the impact of hybrid working on sexual harassment. Some people saying actually remote working, just one flavour of hybrid, lessens risks. Other data suggesting that it heightens risks because people are in a less observed space. So we really want to ensure that UK PLC, that UK businesses are taking a very considered approach to hybrid working. And finally, really taking a truly intersectional approach. So we heard Demi there lay down a bit of a challenge, I think, Demi, although you didn't phrase it like this. So who's in the room here? Who's part of this conversation? And I'm very, very conscious of the need to ensure that there's it's quite a hackneyed phrase, Mary. I think I might have said this with you, a big tent approach to championing gender equity, but it's absolutely the way that we need to go. This isn't going to happen if there's only a small section or one half of society driving change around this. We need to include as many people as possible, and we absolutely need to take an intersectional approach. We need to make sure that we're thinking about this through many different lenses, demographics from age, ethnicity, life stage, you name it. That gives you a flavour, hopefully, of our Equal Futures campaign. Keep your eyes peeled. It's in development. That's the aspiration. That's the plan. And we would love for you to be a part of this. So we'll be sharing further details in follow-up around how you can engage with this campaign. It's something that we're really, really excited about. And I hope you agree with us listening to the panel today. It's something much, much needed. On that, we're going to come to our final remarks then. So if we take that down then, Florence. So I'm going to go in order of Nitesh, Mary, Demi and Ashley, because that's the kind of presentation on my screen. A final comment from you, something reflecting on 2024's International Women's Day, something you're positive or hopeful about.
Thank you, Charlotte. It's been a very fascinating conversation. I am feeling very good and positive about the dialogue. I think the fact that it's a multifaceted issue and opportunity, and we've been sort of coming at it from different points of view, but I'm very positive about the dialogue. What I'm very hopeful for 2024 is that the dialogue translates into policies and the right culture within companies to be able to create an impact for individuals. So it'd be great to get the dialogue to move into policy and action and the supportive environment and culture around those policies.
Thank you so much, Nitesh. Fantastic. Mary, over to you.
Yeah. So the theme this year is accelerate progress, and I think that that's a great way to end it, Charlotte. We've got carers leave, the right to flexible work, and legislation around early pregnancy loss coming into law at the beginning of April. And I think there's an opportunity for every employer here to take those rights and to not just to implement the letter of the law, but to grasp the opportunity to be an employer of choice and to use all of the insight that's available, that the positive difference that being an employer of choice can make. And if we get that happening in more companies, it will trickle down and will become the norm in society. And that's how I think we can accelerate the change.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary. Demi, you're on mute.
I'm unmuted. Thank you, everybody, for all your contributions. It's been a really enlightening conversation. I think the one way for 2024 is change is scary from an employee and employer perspective, but change is necessary. And though it's going to be turbulent, I think we all just need to ride the course for a better future for all of us. And I believe, I'm hopeful and optimistic that all of these social and political barriers can be adapted for all of us in a positive light.
Thank you, Demi. And finally, Ashley, you've heard so many different things from across the panel and the floor here. What thing are you hopeful for when it comes to 2024 and International Women's Day?
It's a really great question, and I think there's multiple things. I said I was very pessimistic, but I'm actually really optimistic for the opportunities that AI presents. I think more than ever, we've got a really transformational tool that's available for us. And I think there are so many cool things, so many good things that we can do to drive better equity in the workplace and across our society. And I'm optimistic that, you know, there are more people than ever who are able to use some of these tools for hopefully a more equitable society that we have. So I'm actually really optimistic about some of the things that we will be able to do because of AI.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. I hope you found this as provocative and as rich and kind of challenging and thoughtful discussion as I have. And crucially, I hope there've also been some really useful kind of takeaway action points for you to take home into your organisation and to think about what you can be doing work around. Before I leave you, just to say we will be sending an email through with links to some of the different activities that we've got coming up, including a PLF series, peer learning forum around AI, some more detail around equal futures, and links to some of the new content we've got coming up around flexible working. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that the rest of your International Women's Day season goes very well. With that, and a big thanks to my panelists, farewell.